Bruce and Garrett. In the process of designing our research and in the interviews that we conducted, we've seen many alt protein supporters focus great enthusiasm on some of the best recognized benefits that come from alt proteins, things like greenhouse gas savings or harm to animals that's avoided. We've even heard some folks indicate that these benefits are perhaps so important and so kind of urgently needed that it's not worth stopping to think about what else the food system could be gaining from alt proteins. And we also see on the other side that the alt protein industry is experiencing intense opposition, criticism, and a lot of disappointment for its shortcomings or sales slumps that may happen. In our report, we're calling this duality between the hyper-positive and the hyper-negative alt protein exceptionalism. We see this as the tendency for alt proteins to receive both really positive and really negative press and attention. And we think that this clouds our understanding and our ability as a food systems organization to be thinking about the true benefits and areas of improvement for alt proteins. So what we're curious for the panelists to speak to today is, what are your thoughts on how this dual kind of hyper-positive, hyper-negative narrative shapes the way that we think about alt proteins, and maybe what would be the most effective way of thinking and talking about alt proteins instead?
Rachel, why don't we start with you? Sure. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a really interesting one. And thinking about the first focusing on the negative attention that plant-based and different alternatives to animal proteins are facing, it's really important to recognize the tremendous traction that plant-based foods have gained, especially in recent years, and how much plant-based is viewed as a threat to our current model and our current system, which is heavily reliant on animal agriculture. This is certainly being recognized by folks who are supporting the animal ag space, and there are a lot of efforts, coordinated efforts, to undermine plant-based and the benefits of plant-based because of that threat that plant-based has. And just to note the trajectory of plant-based, and there have been certainly challenges in the marketplace as of yet, but I think it's really important to ground us in the fact that plant-based foods has grown over the past 3 years, has grown in dollar sales by 45%. Plant-based as an industry across all categories. And plant-based foods now are found in 60% of households across the US, and 80% of people are repeat purchasing plant-based foods after they try them. So that's really tremendous. And as we continue to weather all of the twists and turns and bumps, it's very important to remember those numbers, because those that are promoting and have vested interest in the continued success and expansion of animal agriculture, they're looking at these numbers. So it's important for us to remember that and remember why there are these coordinated attacks on plant-based. And then on the other side, the enthusiasm that advocates, including all of us in this room, have for plant-based foods, we are oftentimes responding by very passionately and defensively supporting plant-based foods. And I think we must do that, and we must continue to do that. However, it must be tempered with understanding that there is still room for growth within this industry, and that it's not perfect yet. It's far from perfect. We're doing a lot of good work. This industry needs to continue to grow and thrive, but we also need to be looking at what are the unmet needs? What are plant-based foods delivering right now that consumers are expecting from plant-based foods? And we put out some research a few months ago on unmet needs, and we're finding that consumers are looking for more interesting flavor profiles. They want more convenient, ready-to-eat meals. The industry needs to respond. We also are finding that consumers are not satisfied with plant-based cheeses that are on the market right now, how they're functioning, their taste, the texture of them. So it's important for us to also say, okay, we have a lot of room for improvement in how we're thinking about products, how we're creating new products, also how we're communicating around those products to consumers. And then also one other thing I wanted to note is that it's important for us to think about coming back to the question of the common good, how we realize the maximum benefit of this food systems transformation that we're all committed to throughout the entire value chain. And we have a lot of programs. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into it now, but thinking about how do we think about the sourcing of the ingredients that goes into these products, going everywhere from the seed through to the farmers and the workers in the value chain, and how those ingredients are grown. Are they grown in the same way that the monoculture corn and soy that's going into animal feed are grown, or are we thinking proactively about moving to more resilient and regenerative forms of agriculture? How do we address the accessibility of these foods? So while I think it's very important that we continue to promote these products and the benefits, we also need to be taking a very realistic look at where can we make improvement and how do we do both of those things in conjunction with one another.
Why don't we move to Bruce next, and then we'll do Garrett final.
So, I think it's worth level setting about why GFI and a lot of people who are enthusiastic about alternative proteins are so enthusiastic about alternative proteins. We've recently had a lot of success meeting with people in the climate community about alternative proteins and their value to climate mitigation. And we're framing it as the third pillar alongside renewable energy and electric vehicles. And the thing that is so powerful about renewable energy and electric vehicles, if you look at those trajectories, is that science anywhere can scale globally. So you look at the history of solar, and it started in the US, then Germany, then Japan, then China, and we now have a reasonable shot at the world shifting to renewables. There's a similar trajectory that has worked for electric vehicles, and we think, and we've been pressure testing this, that if you think about everything everybody is doing across the various SDGs as they apply to food, so labor justice, you get successes in one country, or even one city, or against one corporation, and what it looks like for that to scale is not obvious. Walkable cities, all of the examples that I gave a minute ago about great things to do in renewable energy and electric vehicles. What does it look like if you get New York City to go 100% plant-based for that to happen in China or Japan or wherever else? We think, and if anybody has a disagreement on this, I'm around for the next couple of days and would love to hear it. We think alternative proteins, and let's figure out how to biomimic the precise meat experience with plants or using cellular agriculture. What does it look like to do that globally? And we think it's the one thing that analogizes. There are, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's the one thing where like GFI has offices in Israel and Singapore, not because we're trying to influence what people are eating in Israel and Singapore. Our entire two-question, GFI is in 7 areas of the world, and the only 2 questions we ask are, does the government fund a whole lot of science? And do they have world-class scientific institutions to take that funding? Because the scientific breakthroughs anywhere can happen everywhere. So that's the sort of thesis of the enthusiasm for alternative proteins. And then the New York Times comes along and says, wait a minute, we're not really sure that Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat are better than JBS and Tyson, because literally, they're not telling us whether the coconut shells are recycled. What is the, so yes, it uses 1/20 of the land, and yes, it causes 90% less climate change, and yes, it slashes air pollution and all these other things, but what are you doing with your coconut shells? Literally, New York Times, you can, Google Pat Brown's head explodes, New York Times, and this article will pop up. Or Ezra Klein writes a really powerful article for the Sunday New York Times, and it says governments should be putting billions of dollars into open access R&D, which is kind of a response to another one of our questions in a minute, on alternative proteins, and should be putting billions of dollars into this to solve climate, pandemic risk, AMR, et cetera. And Mark Bittman says, no, this is horrible. Ezra's nuts. Here are the 10 better things to do. And you read the 10 better things, and they're all great things to do. But not one of them is even trying to cause animal agriculture to go down by 1 gazillionth of 1%. Should we be getting racism out of USDA? Absolutely. Should we be working for a living wage for slaughterhouse workers? Absolutely. Should we be working on things like cover crops and regenerative agriculture? Absolutely. Just like we should be working for walkable cities and better public transport and all these other things. But it does feel to me like we talk past one another. And at least in the alternative protein side, we sometimes hear there's this big dispute between alternative proteins and other people. I don't see us attacking anything they're doing. But I do see them saying alternative proteins is not a silver bullet. Nobody said it was a silver bullet. Alternative proteins doesn't solve every problem in the food system. Nobody says it does. So this is what, this is how at least I see it.
Thanks, Bruce. I'll let Viv go, and then I know Misha wanted to chime in.
Check. All right, we're back on this one. So this question about these dual extremes, I often joke that what I do for a living is study people fighting about meat on the internet. And it's just, probably not best for my mental well-being, but it's gotten me a tenured position, so I suppose it works. So I think there's a couple of things that are really important to ask, right? Why do people fight so much about this topic, right? We see it constantly. So I think there's a couple things worth noting. One is, and I know Melanie Joy is around here somewhere, I think these concepts around things like carnism and meat attachment matter a lot, right? That meat has a deep symbolic value in culture, in history. It's related to masculinity, classic work by Carol Adams and other folks like that, right? It's about, nutrition transitions and economic striving, right? And so meat matters a lot. It's not just about the food product, it's about the cultural meanings around meat. And so when we get into conversations about replacing meat, that brings up a variety of these cultural attachments as well as the associated economic attachments that folks have to it. The other thing that I think is intersecting with that are broader ideologies around technology and the intersection between technology and food specifically, but technology in general, right? There's this great book called The Wizards and the Prophets that some folks might be familiar with, but it talks about these sort of different ways of thinking about social change. Wizards tend to move toward, technological solutions, really see a lot of value in centralized technological systems to make social change. Prophets much more skeptical, not just of the technologies, but the political and economic institutions that surround those technologies, calling for more kind of grassroots social change. And I think at a conference like this, we have a mix of wizards and prophets and a lot of folks in between. So I think with this conversation about alternative proteins, it's digging into these really deeply held identities and ideologies related to the role of meat in society and the ideal role of technology in society. And then you put all of that on top of a foundation of a crisis in institutional trust that we're experiencing, not just in the United States, but around the world, right? I actually woke up this morning to a data set. I've had a survey out for the last couple months, and the data just came back to me of public perceptions of plant-based and cell-cultured meat, but with a bunch of questions about trust. What institutions do you trust? Who would you trust if you saw a product that had, that was approved by this group versus that group? I just looked at the data for the first time at 7 o'clock this morning, but I'm not seeing a ton of difference in who they trust because they don't seem to trust anybody, is one of the big findings, I think, early. Haven't run the significance test, but my first glance at that shows there's just this deep level of distrust in everything. And I think coming out of COVID, that distrust has deepened. And I think our media environment and our media platforms have, taken what has been a kind of decades-long loss of trust and just accelerated that, right? And to some of Bruce's points about the way these media narratives play out, right? That our media systems are incentivized towards polarization, towards sort of the most bad faith reading of someone, of anybody else. And so that's the context here, right? Meat, technology, and trust. It's a really hard place to be. And so I think it's in that context, how do we engage in that context? And I think the most important thing that we can do is, one, recognize that the whole world is not going to have consensus around these issues, right? And so we have to, I think, move away from this idea that we're going to be able to convince everybody of all things. There's always going to be disagreement here, and so we have to figure out what are the audiences where there are opportunities to make inroads, and how do we engage and make progress there, and then how do we kind of try to build some of those bridges with those who might not necessarily ultimately come to our side, but we can at least build some level of relationship. And I think the guiding star for the industry has to be truth and honesty and transparency. Because in this time of distrust, and when there's already some of the odds stacked against us based on people's cultural attachments to things like meat, they're looking for any way to knock the argument of alternative proteins, right? And that's the coconut shell, right? They're just looking for anything to undermine this. And so honesty, truth, transparency, to beware, and again, I think learning from the COVID context, I think there's a lot we can learn about some of the mistakes that were made from a public health communication perspective. This tendency to tell people, there's a risk communication specialist who talks about the problems of noble lies, right? This idea of telling people things that we know are not 100% true, but they're the things that we think are going to get them to do the thing that we ultimately want them to do. And I think we saw this a lot in the COVID context, telling these noble lies, from the public health establishments. And what that did was it just completely undermined the trust that was already undermined. And so I think that needs to be top of mind for everybody in this industry. How do we move forward with honesty and integrity, recognize the nuance of food systems, the complexity of food systems, the challenges that we're facing in terms of, matching taste and price and convenience, the existing challenges in the value chain. Let's not try to hide that stuff. Let's be honest about that stuff and where we're making progress, but also where more progress needs to come. So I'll leave it there.
I just want to, sorry.
Please go, Dan.
Yeah, I think we also need to recognize these companies are new. Most of the founders do not come from food, and many of them made mistakes, and it's okay. I think many companies overpromised, underdelivered, and I think they did it all in the spotlight, many times by choice. So if you're saying, I am just as good as, that's a very big statement. You shouldn't need to do that. So and we've been learning a lot. Over the past 6 years, we've invested in many, many companies, and some have done better than others, and it's about learning from the mistakes, understanding how do we connect with consumers, how do we comply with manufacturing, which is much more complex than anybody wants to realize, and how do we hit basically singles and doubles instead of going for grand slams every time that we're at bat. So I think that needs to be part of the equation for real change.
I'm glad you spoke up, Dan, because I was going to blame this exceptionalism on venture capital. Because I think that not many venture capitalists are like you and are patient and understand kind of how tech pushes forward at a certain pace and so on. And we have so many companies that are out there doing articles because they're really vying for the attention of investors. It's not marketing like you would be for, a new recipe or cauliflower rice or something where it's like it just is what it is and we're marketing it. This is the all protein exceptionalism comes from the fact that for at least the cell cultured products, a lot of the benefits are still speculative. They're very promising and there's a lot of theory behind them, but we're not going to actually get them until we can scale, and we're not going to scale until we have the money to do the research, and we're not going to have the money to do the research until we can get the attention of an investor. So I need to also put it out there that a lot of the messaging that comes into the media and feels directed to us as consumers is kind of more so directed to the venture space. And that's what we need, but of course the consumers don't know that. So as things don't keep up with the pace of innovation and we don't meet those timelines, you have damaged the trust of the consumers because you're using a single channel to communicate with both. So it's a really challenging scenario, and I'd like to just blame the system again for setting us up that way, because ultimately a lot of this research should have been funded by governments. It should have been more in the public space first so that we wouldn't force companies into this position where they have to fundraise so much money for products that, could have had a lot more scientific foundation behind it.
Thank you all so much. This is a wonderful conversation. We have just 10 minutes left.